Hello, welcome again to Sport Unlocked, going through the week's sports news with me, Rob Harris from Sky News, Martyn Ziegler from The Times, and Tariq Panja from The New York Times. Remember, if you're enjoying the pod, we're grateful if you can hit subscribe, rate, and review us on wherever you're listening to your podcast from. And later we'll get to the UEFA call we're on, revealing all the finances that European football is making. But first, the last week or so has seen the launch of the new athletic season. Did anyone really notice the Diamond League launching?
Well, if you were to ask me where the Diamond League was held, I'm afraid I couldn't tell you.
I could tell you because Rob told me earlier. It was in Qatar in Doha. It just doesn't register, does it? And it's a real shame. Seb Coe has obviously been president of World Athletics for a number of years, and he's talked about, especially in those early days, about all these kind of newfangled ideas he had to kind of get the sport some prominence. But it doesn't feel like any of it's worked. It just doesn't land a blow when it comes to ratings or people talking about it.
I mean, even when you search Google News, one of the hits for the Diamond League in Doha is actually who's competing. It's the preview to the event. There isn't considerable coverage actually of the event. We did have Sha'Carri Richardson winning the 100 metres, the fastest time of 2023. A lot are building up to the World Championships in August. But the sport just doesn't seem to be doing enough to promote itself. The athletes aren't doing enough to try to cut through, are they?
I think there's a problem with the kind of star factor. Usain Bolt, for years and years was a sort of huge draw, wasn't he? And when you don't have a really, really strong, powerful star names, that becomes a bit of a problem. So I think it's how you find them, and also there's a sort of ongoing battle with doping, isn't there? There's a problem athletics has to go over that people now are sort of a bit dubious when somebody breaks a world record or something because there have been so many problems in the past. Yeah, World Athletics are dealing with the doping issue really, really well, but I think it's not easy.
Yeah, all those doubts often, even when there is a great performance, and there is no real sign. Although Seb Coe has done a lot to try to clean up the sport, particularly move on from the Russia scandal since becoming president of World Athletics, of actually getting that sort of buzz around the sport, that anticipation, the fact that we are actually building up to the World Championships. There is a narrative, but how do you get people interested in that? And so often it's not the best competing at the Diamond League meets, are they? It can depend on how much they're being paid locally. So it often is only at a World Champs or the Olympics where we know we will see the very best athletes competing.
I mean, there's a situation coming up in England this summer in London, at the London Stadium. There's the Diamond League meeting there, and ticket sales just haven't been high enough. And it looks like they're going to have to UK Athletics are going to have to be bailed out. They've applied to UK Sport, which is a sort of a public organisation, for I think £300,000, which they need to sort of make ends meet. And I suppose there's a question: should public money be used for this purpose? I mean, I think maybe part of UK sports remit is to support the international events coming to the country, so it can perhaps be justified. But it's a sort of strange situation where you've got this situation, one of the biggest athletics events, and it's still going to be running at a loss.
I think it's bigger than that, though, isn't it, guys? It's an issue of when was athletics popular on television. You have to go back a really long way before streaming, really before this kind of multi-channel world we live in now. If we're talking about where we are in Great Britain, it was on BBC One or BBC Two, the Diamond League. You remember that? Characters like Linford Christie, Leroy Burrell in the men's 100 metres, Carl Lewis's tail end of his career. That's when it was quite big. And it's because there wasn't that many other options for your attention. It was there on those main channels. It's now competing with so many other products, and it's losing that battle, isn't it? And football, for example, is now an all year round property. It's just very hard for it to cut through, isn't it?
mean, in the UK, it was shown on BBC Two, the Dara Diamond League. But you mentioned football there, and football being an all-year-round sport, that's in largely part now even more so due to the growth of the women's game. So a lot more people are watching women's football. We'll have the Women's World Cup this summer, which sort of 15, 20 years ago wouldn't have had that sort of complete global prominence, and probably something has to give when you're deciding what sport to engage with.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a lot more choice. But then if you look at what some of those other sports have done to get attention, is doing this programming off the field. I mean, the best example is that obviously Drive to Survive element of Formula One. I can't think of any innovation or any characters that are cutting through from the world of athletics in that way at all.
One issue in athletics is brought up is the confusing nature of watching it. The field events going on at the same time as the track events, and you're jumping from one event to the other, and how do you actually follow the two? And that can be a sort of confusing thing, not only if you're in the stadium in particular, but on TV as well.
Yeah, I mean, I still think it needs something like great rivalries. I mean, great rivalries always make great sport, don't they? Thinking back to the 1990s and, those sprinters, for example, all those sprinters, I know, Carl Lewis, Linford Christie, it was, these were sort of not just household names, but it was, everybody knew what they were doing, and it sort of actually built up to the Olympics. Now it just seems that the Olympics is sort of everything. And whether it's the European Championships or the Diamond League, I mean, is there too much? That's the other thing. Is there too much?
Maybe the Premier League needs to get involved, get the best of the Premier League's elite taking part in athletics events. I wonder if that would sell out the Olympic Stadium.
Well, I do remember, this is dating us all a little bit, Satan Greavesy used to have a program on ITV back in the 80s, when footballers didn't earn as much money as they do now. They televised this event at Wembley, and it would be like, who's the fastest player, and then have them sprinting. I'm not sure clubs or their insurers would be willing to let their players participate in events like that, or who's got the hardest shot.
Well, as athletics struggles to sell the rights and build the audience around the world, that's not an issue for European football competitions. The three of us are on a call this week with UEFA's Deputy General Secretary Giorgio Marchetti, talking about the finances that they're expecting to generate from the new look to club competitions from 2024. We've got that newly expanded Champions League, which jumps from 32 to 36 teams. We've got a load more games, and what we're hearing is that they're expecting to generate up to 4.8 billion euros per season. Is this going to just entrench the top end of the game? Is there going to be fair financial distribution? What sense did you get from him from the call?
I think it's a big challenge, isn't it? So that's a 33% increase. I think the challenge for UEFA and for the clubs, and in fact for football, is this 33% going to be mirrored amongst the Champions League clubs? Are they just going to get a sort of a third more money than they do now? Because that is going to increase the gap between those in Europe and those who aren't. It's already, you can see it in the Premier League. It's a massive thing. It's £100 million difference, just about. Maybe if you in the Europa League, it's you get 30 million, but you get about £100 million in English club in the Champions League. If you're now going to get another 30 million, that's huge. And is that going to distort the domestic competition? So this is a big problem potentially. And there's a working party set up involving the ECA, European leagues, and UEFA to deal with this and decide on the financial distribution.
You were asking about coefficient payments, weren't you? So what is all that about, and what sense did you get from it?
Yeah, so the coefficient pillar, as it's called, there's sort of various pillars of how which make up the finances of the competition. One is the TV money is split according to how you've performed in Europe over the last 10 years. And it's that last season, that chunk of money went between about 1 million euros for the lowest ranked club in the Champions League up to 32 million for the highest ranked, which was Real Madrid. Is that fair? Because you also get points for the number of European Cups you've won or Champions Leagues you've won, European trophies. So this in a way, this is sort of building in an advantage for the established clubs who have a sort of long and successful history there. So, for example, Newcastle United, if they qualify next season, their 10-year coefficient will be 0. They will get somewhere between sort of, depending on who else qualifies, between 1 and 3 million euros. Manchester City will get close to 30 million euros. It's all these, UEFA are looking at this. I think they are sort of suggesting they're going to keep it, but perhaps reduce it.
Giorgio's point, and again, I'm not a great fan of coefficients, but he said, the Premier League is one thing. We don't have the things you described there of clubs with big histories or big fan bases getting more money from television rights. But in other countries, in Spain, in Portugal, all sorts of other leagues in Europe have a dimension where this type of thing already exists. So it's kind of in keeping with what happens on the continent, he was arguing. And the other point was this thing has replaced the old market pool payout, which meant that teams from countries that are paying the biggest amounts in TV rights would get a lion's share of this money. And that, again, is a very divisive thing and not very equal. It's a very complex calculation they're trying to make, isn't it?
And in part, this is due to Leicester City, isn't it? How much they earned after reaching the Champions League for the first time in 2016, a point that friend Graham Dunbar asked Giorgio.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think Real Madrid, Bayern Munich were sort of a bit angry that Leicester City sort of arrived in the Champions League, having never done it before, and made considerably more money than either of those two clubs. So they took the opportunity. Actually, it was between Michel Platini leaving as UEFA president and Schäferin being elected. During that summer, there was a sort of power vacuum, and Karl-Heinz Rummenigge effectively sort of pushed through this coefficient funding model, where they would money. England had the biggest TV contracts and therefore had the biggest market pool, and so they changed it so that part of it would be done on this coefficient funding basis.
One of the things that struck me, and it also happened actually just towards the end of Platini's reign, the plans for the European third competition, which became the Conference League, which was created to give more clubs an opportunity to play European football. And while we did hear from Georgia about the many hundreds of more teams featuring in the competitions, that very often is in the early stages, isn't it? The qualifying rounds, the group stage. Whereas once we get to the end of the tournaments, we are still seeing teams from the traditional European powers, aren't we? A bit like Roma last season with Mourinho winning the Conference League. Although maybe it's giving the chance to those sort of now secondary or third level clubs within those major leagues. But we're not seeing small countries getting their teams reaching the latter stages, are we, of the Conference League in particular?
No, we won't. We won't. And it's not all UEFA's fault either. I mean, you have to take a broader look at the football economy. The Premier League, in terms of if you're looking at growing inequality in football and the success of the Premier League in generating huge amounts of revenue is a big differential. For example, it doesn't matter. In a way, we're talking about the UEFA distribution, but the Premier League's television market and how much it makes is so vast that middling teams in the Premier League, even in the bottom half, will be competing with Juventus, you mentioned, and top teams for talent. And one of the points I've made to Georgia was the only conversation we seem to be having in European football is about money and who's getting what and who's getting. But for the fans, I don't think they care specifically about money. What they care about is their team being able to compete, having some chance. And yeah, it's about money because you're buying the best players. So why are UEFA not looking at ways of stopping teams, a handful of teams monopolizing the best talent? And it doesn't only have to be about money. There could be sporting rules on number of transfers teams could make per year, number of registered professionals, just so you have a better split of players across territories. Otherwise, you're talking about 5 million, 10 million, 15 million. I mean, it doesn't really matter.
The one thing that also struck me about looking at the new Champions League from next season, I mean, it's going to be something like 50 odd more matches, which is all going to be available on TV. And you got this thing with EFL in England announced last week, a new deal with Sky. They're going to be 1,000 matches a season available for transmission. It's just like everywhere you look, there's going to be football, especially if you're in England now, or mind you, other clubs already, other countries already show all their matches live, don't they? So, is there a sort of danger of like having too much on TV, and or is that just the sort of modern life?
It's a saturation, but it's that again. All these channels are available, and the option is there. That said, we're recording this a day after West Ham played AZ Alkmaar in the first leg of the semi-final of the Conference League, the third tier, sellout stadium in London, great atmosphere. So for the fans of the teams competing, it still means it's a big deal, chance to get to a European final. And and AZ Alkmaar traditionally aren't one of the biggest teams in the Netherlands, are they? They've got to the semi-finals through shrewd management and just smart team building. But it's still quite exciting, isn't it? So depending on the game, isn't it?
As we saw the way Mourinho certainly revelled in winning the Conference League last season, it's more memorable than the Europa League, maybe, in terms of the winners last season.
I mean, that's a man who can sell newspapers and get himself in media, isn't it? I mean, he's box office, and I think that's great for the competition, isn't it?
One weird thing about this season's Europa Conference League is the final being played in Prague, in a stadium with only 18,000 seats. What a very strange decision. I'm not quite sure, A, why the Czechs decided to put forward that stadium as their suggested option, and B, why UEFA are happy to go along with it. I mean, as you say, sell-out crowd at the London Stadium. Only going to be a tiny minority of West Ham supporters, if they reach the final, you're going to be able to get there.
And so when UEFA chooses their venues, they're trying to think of a distribution across Europe, particularly now they want the Champions League final only to be in particularly large stadiums in cities that can cope, given the criticism in the past. Actually, when Kyiv had it in 2018, it created a struggle to get there. But there are sort of perhaps fewer huge stadium options for UEFA to take the game to. And on the other side, I think particularly in the past with the early stages of the Europa League a few years ago, was actually them fearing having a vast stadium without many fans there if you ended up with sort of two teams without a huge fan base. But the way the European landscape is now, we are seeing larger teams reaching those finals, aren't we? Which would point to having a large fan base that wants to go to these games.
I think also it's a case of the competition maybe being more successful than they thought it would be. I think they I remember when they were creating it, and it's almost like a political idea as well, part of Shefferin's push, isn't it? Since he came into office, to talk about doing more for small and medium-sized teams and countries, and this was one of those. This was one of those elements, and I think it's proved to be a bit more successful, certainly when it comes to some of the teams getting to the latter stages of that than they bargained for.
Of course, the ideal solution would be choosing the final venue when you know who's reached the final and what demand there is for tickets. But Paris and the Champions League final showed the necessity of having a longer build-up to be able to plan for these events, particularly as UEFA in the last week have finally issued their response to the report into the Champions League final chaos, which actually, from my reading of it, still doesn't deal with how you potentially overrule local authorities, which you can't do, to take control of security at a game.
It did say, though, that the head of security will actually take on the responsibility of being the head of security at UEFA, which makes you wonder what he was doing before. I find that quite mind-boggling that finally they think, right, this person who is the head of security will now do his job, which is a really odd thing to think about.
You mentioned watching games from the EFL there, and perhaps England's League Two will have some of those in-demand football matches in the world next season because of Wrexham's promotion. And Martyn, a bit of news about Wrexham and the ownership there you've got.
Yeah, so quite an interesting one. I mean, that we've done things in the past looking at sort of state funding of clubs. I mean, there's been issues around Barcelona, around Madrid, but actually they're sort of fairly openly. Like Wrexham are going to have an incredible sort of cash injection from the Welsh government, £17 million, to update the racecourse ground, make it, I think, increased to 19,000 seats from about 11,000. but it's a lot of money. So Ryan Reynolds, when he bought the club, I think that cost 2 million, and they got then they bought the stadium for another 2 million. So this is sort of a huge amount of money that's coming in from the Welsh government by the local authority. I think the argument is it'll mean that they can hold Wales internationals there again. Haven't done so for a long time. But it's an interesting moot point about should governments be allowed to upgrade stadiums for a club like this?
4 times the purchase price based on the numbers you've used. So that is public money for private profit, even though, the Ryan Reynolds and the other chap, whose name escapes me, have put Wrexham on the map in the States and elsewhere through their ownership. Very savvy investment, that, and very great storytelling. They knew exactly what they were doing. I mean, the amount of coverage it's had has been spectacular. But it's a bit jarring to think that, especially in these times, public money will be used to build a stadium for private owners. Something that's quite common in the United States, actually, whether it's NFL stadiums or even some of these new Major League Soccer stadiums. There's been a lot of public money used, and it's a big debate in the US as well.
Rob McElhenney is the other guy, isn't it?
Thank you. Sorry, Rob McElhenney, if you're listening.
A lot of the Wrexham players seem to have been enjoying themselves in Las Vegas, celebrating their promotion, thanks to the owners. So it'll be interesting to see how that one fits into the next series. US is one of those places, actually, that's getting into the cricket fever. Another 2020 competition is set to launch there as we approach what's the English cricketing summer with the Ashes between England and Australia. And it seems constantly we're hearing about more and more cricket, aren't we? Yet new T20 competitions. Now, what, one in Saudi Arabia potentially?
Yeah, this is really significant, isn't it? So the Saudis have been in talks with the Indian cricket authorities and the Indian Premier League about setting up their own T20 league there. This is seen as a real threat to English cricket. In fact, the ECB put out an annual report this week where they said that the growth of global franchise leagues was a quote major risk about around the future of English cricket. Basically, because it means the sort of the salary inflation, the top players all going to these leagues, and that's really going to affect things like potentially the 100, the new competition in England, as well as Test cricket potentially. But I think the Saudi thing, Tariq, is significant because it means Indian players may now play outside of the IPL.
There is a rule in India that any Indian contracted players in the IPL cannot play in any other franchise leagues. But I guess the Saudi money on offer is so significant, not only to the players, but to the Indian Cricket Board, that that's now going to be waved through. And that is massive because it means, like, Virat Kohli and the others, big superstars, will be playing in cricket mad Saudi Arabia, maybe one of these days. Money, basically, Martyn, is the answer there. And I saw the owner of one of the franchises in India talking about Test cricket, and basically, the ECB's right to be worried, suggesting that this kind of year-round Test cricket calendar that we know is likely to be upended, and it might just be an annual event when Test cricket is played at some point. He tried to talk about it like a Wimbledon or a French Open or something like that. These just very specific windows for Test cricket, and the rest will be this franchise cricket.
Yeah, I think a challenge for sort of the TV rights values of these bilateral Test matches. I mean, obviously, the Ashes is a big one, but what sort of TV rights values are you going to get for England and South Africa, for example?
Yeah,
If
and what players are
all the
available?
focus is on, yeah, well, that's right. I mean, there's suggestions that some of these franchises are going to have contracts with players saying that they have first choice on them throughout the whole year. So that's an issue facing. In fact, I think the ECB have responded by saying that for their central contracts for their players, they're not just going to do it on a year by year basis. They're now going to start doing it on a multi-year basis to try and fend off that threat.
And up against Saudi money, plus this booming Indian TV market, you could see a lot of those players perhaps not signing up to ECB central contracts, and that's quite a worry. And with Saudi Arabia as well, what is it that they're not buying? Rob, what's the list? We've got Live Golf, Newcastle in the Premier League. They've got Formula One. Talks about potentially investing in Formula One, WWE. I think it is the
boxing that they've got there, the big fights, potentially Messi going to play there as well. They've got winter sports yet?
Oh yes, they've got the Asian Winter Games.
Huge variety there. I mean, when we talk about cricket, though, power to the players in terms of getting their choice to compete where they want to. It's actually what the live golfers are sort of calling for, aren't they? Well, they've gone off of their own back. But the T20 competitions do generate that buzz that, as we started the pod saying, athletics isn't.
Yeah, quite right. Yeah, it's hugely popular. It's actually, it's a compacted 3-hour schedule. It brings a new audience into it, and I must say, it's fun to watch. These are good events.
Well, like I say, we are actually 167th in the Saudi Apple Sports Pod chart.
Wow.
Well, we're always grateful for you listening to us, and if you hit subscribe, we'll land in your feed automatically, and you can always message us at Sport Unlocked on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And thank you everyone for listening. Goodbye for now.